All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Good morning or good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Elizabeth Anderson. I'm the Senior Research and Evaluation Manager for the Freedom Fund, based out of Washington, D.C. I have the pleasure of moderating our webinar today and would like to start with going over some housekeeping. If I could have the next slide, Joanna. So their session will be recorded and a link will be shared with everyone who has registered for the event. The live captioning, closed captioning is available if, for those who have hearing impairment or who would otherwise like to see closed captioning. The Q&A function is enabled, and so we will be setting some time aside at the end for all of our presenters to share back, to respond to any questions. So please go ahead and submit your questions in the chat function throughout the presentation by clicking on the chat at the bottom of your screen. Next slide, please, Joanna. And then finally, I quickly wanted to give a plug that our report relative to this presentation is now available. The link is up on the screen, and we will be able to share that with the recording to anyone who has registered for the event. And next, I'd like to present our speakers. Joanna Buza is the principal investigator of the Meneshachin study. She's an associate professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where she community-based health research with a focus on vulnerable populations. She lived in Ethiopia between 2013 and 2018. And during that time, she established the Migration and Health Research Action Group in collaboration with Addis Ababa University. Additionally, we're joined by Mahlet Mekbib, who is a part of Freedom Fund Ethiopia's team to support anti-trafficking interventions in Ethiopia, focusing on safer migration of women who head to the Middle East for work, as well as tackling the exploitation of child domestic workers in Ethiopia. She has 10+ years of experience working on programs related to vulnerable children, girls, and women in Ethiopia, the West and East Africa regions. So Joanna and Mahlet, over to you for the next 30 minutes, after which we will be taking some questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. It's a delight to be here and to present our hard work finally after quite a couple of years with an extension due to the delays due to COVID. This is a quick outline of what we'll be presenting with a focus on the research findings and their kind of implications for the future of policy and practice. Just to give a quick overview, it's well known that there are a lot of women who migrate from Ethiopia to the countries of the Middle East and the Gulf states in order to be domestic workers. And over the years, there's been a lot of documented evidence about the challenges that they face, including trafficking, labor exploitation, and quite a lot of harms to their physical, mental, and sexual health. And Ethiopia has made a real effort to try to counteract and mitigate these potential harms. But so far, much of the programming has been about encouraging women who want to migrate to go the sort of regular route, to raise awareness of the potential dangers and risks, and to establish kind of a regularized system of recruitment of women to, for their migration journeys. There's been very little known about how migrants actually plan their journeys and how they take decisions about whether or not to, in fact, take that regular route out of the country. Certainly, it's very hard to get any accurate numbers, but certainly it's clear that very large numbers of female migrants continue to go informally, meaning outside of the legal framework that is there for their protection. So what this research set out to do is to try to fill these gaps in knowledge around what roles are played by a whole range of different actors from community level all the way through the immigration authorities in assisting with the transit and placement of Ethiopian women into domestic labor abroad. And also we really wanted to try to understand from the perspective of migration facilitators what their role is and what their motivations are, and from the experiences of communities, how they view the relative benefits and risks of different types of facilitators. So this is the culmination of 2 years of work. We had 2 phases of field work. The first phase was very much focused in Addis Ababa. We talked to a lot of policymakers and stakeholders and licensed labor recruiters to get a greater understanding of how the regularized system works or is meant to work and how it's been set up. There have been quite a lot of recent proclamations and legal frameworks put into place in Ethiopia to try to make the entire process formalized and easier to monitor, and the idea is to reduce risks. But then what we really wanted to focus on in the second phase of the data collection is what's actually happening on the ground outside of perhaps what's written in these laws and proclamations. So what I'm going to be presenting now focuses much more on phase 2. But across the whole study, we conducted over 150 interviews, and this was a qualitative study in the sense that rather than try to have a population representative sample and implement a survey, we were really trying to understand holistically the kinds of perceptions and experiences of the people involved in both migrating and in facilitating the migration process. And so you can see here the different kinds of people that we spoke to, both at community level and, as I mentioned, at sort of policy level. Just a quick word on terminology. We were working across 3 languages. So our interviews were all conducted in 2 Ethiopian languages, Amharic, which is the national language, and the Oromo language, or Mifa, and also in Hadiyisa, which is what they speak in Hadiya zone. And all of this is then being translated English to present to you. So obviously there's a lot of nuance and complexity and confusion around how we translate key terms. So it's important to highlight how we have, for the sake of our report and presenting our findings, kind of standardized the terminology. And we've had to take decisions from the 3 languages how people were using them in different contexts. So basically, a facilitator is the broadest category. It's any kind of person who is engaged in assisting women migrating from Ethiopia into domestic work abroad. It may or may not be something they do professionally. It may be something they do quite informally, just for family or friends, or it may be something that they do alongside their other work. Recruiters are professional agents who are responsible for that final step of ensuring the woman leaves the country and reaches the destination country and for her work. And some recruiters are registered and some are not registered, but they are sort of full-time. That's their main source of livelihood. And then a broker always refers to somebody who's doing something in a very informal capacity, usually at the most sort of immediate community level, and an intermediary who is helping to link migrants to someone who can help them further along in their journey. So the first part of the findings that I'll present relates to specifically the role and activities of recruitment facilitators of different types. What we first wanted to do was try to understand what actually happens in practice. How do migrants get out of the country? What are all the steps along the way? Who is involved and what activities do they conduct? And some of the main themes that we found was, the first one is that outside of the capital city, Addis Ababa, there are actually very few, in fact, we found none, registered agencies. So when somebody wants to migrate for domestic work and she is not based anywhere near Addis Ababa, she's going to struggle to actually have contact with a registered or a licensed recruitment agency. And it's not always feasible for a potential migrant or her family member to travel to the capital city just to find one. And furthermore, they don't really know how they can identify a licensed versus an unlicensed agent. So what happens is you end up with sort of outreach workers. You end up with brokers or facilitators of different types working at community level who are linking them to the people who are in Addis Ababa who eventually help them leave the country. And that is technically illegal. Technically, licensed recruitment agencies are not allowed to deploy staff in the rural areas. And you can see for each of these themes, I've included some illustrative quotes to show you how people talked about these issues. So what happens is you end up with what people refer to as chains, long kind of webs or a kind of step-by-step linkage from the community level where migrants might be living and seeking to leave the country, all the way to when she actually does leave the country. And these sort of long chains include local people, it include kind of professional intermediaries who move women from villages to kind of feeder towns that have better transport where they can then get on a bus and go to Addis Ababa or go to Bahadar if they're going to take an overland route rather than to fly out of the airport. And so often when we spoke to recruiters, they weren't even sure how far along they were in the chain. Particularly outside of Addis Ababa, they talked about how their job was perhaps to collect women from a range of different places and get them on a bus. And then they just had the phone number of the next person who collected them off that bus and maybe linked them to somebody who could get them on a plane out of the country. So these chains, as you can also see in that lower quote, these chains went all the way into kind of government institutions. So they might start with somebody who locally just finds prospective migrants and helps them get an ID card and get on a bus, but it might end with people who are actually based in embassies or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then at the airport, various police that may need to be paid along the way. So it's quite a tangled picture of all the different kinds of people and how they relate to one another. And unsurprisingly, because for many of these facilitators, it's how they earn money, they're in direct competition with one another for the business of the prospective migrants. And this encourages them to slightly exaggerate or sometimes quite seriously deceive migrants in terms of their working conditions, how much money they might expect to earn when they go abroad, and to kind of market themselves as the best option for a prospective migrant. And we had a lot of information from returnee migrants and even from young women who hadn't even left yet, who said, yeah, we kind of know that they paint a false picture. And once you get there, it's not like what you might have expected. And then there were also all these different assumptions about the actual situation of licensing. So licensing is the government sanctioned way that a recruiter is allowed to legally perform recruitment and registering women into domestic work overseas. And the ones who are in the middle of the chain often said that they were, even though they were operating illegally, it was okay because they were linking women to licensed recruiters in Addis Ababa. And therefore, it was not their problem to ensure the safety of these women. The safety depended on the agency that would actually send them to the destination country. And as I mentioned previously, it was very difficult for anybody to really be sure of the legal status of whoever actually put the person on the plane to leave the country. And in fact, there was an overwhelming belief that if you traveled by plane out of Addis Ababa Bole Airport, you must be going legally, because by definition, if you've been issued with a passport and someone stamps it at the airport, the government must know that you exist and where you're going. And there was a real confidence that it was legal if you went by plane. So, and aside from that, there was a lot of confusion about who was registered and who wasn't, and that included from all of the intermediary facilitators along the way. And then finally, there was generally a sense that that facilitators really didn't have the capability in protecting migrants. That in a way, this was quite a realistic view, that if your job is to link somebody from a village to another facilitator in the next large town on the way to Addis Ababa, you know, what happens to them after that, you have no way of controlling. And similarly, the recruiters who were sending women from Addis Ababa, whether they were licensed or not licensed, felt like the fate of the women was in the hands of their employers or the legal frameworks or the protection or lack thereof in whichever country that they ended up. And furthermore, a lot of the facilitators are themselves operating kind of in a hidden, clandestine way because they're outside of the sort of legal framework. And so, as you can see in that first quote in blue, you know, leave alone protecting the migrants, I'm not able to protect myself because I'm in an illegal line of business. So there's generally a sense by the facilitators that there wasn't much that they could do, and they didn't really see it as their responsibility to secure the safety of the women that they were helping. So now let's turn to what prospective migrants, returnees, their family members, what their perceptions are of these different types of facilitators and what they were prioritizing or what they felt were the relevant risks and benefits of each type. So the first thing to say is that, like, perhaps unsurprisingly, I think like most of us, we trust our friends, our relatives, our close community contacts more than information that's available through government awareness raising campaigns, for example. So we were told time and time again, well, I found a broker because my sister had gone with him, or my neighbor had gone with him, or I communicated by WhatsApp or another social media platform with my family members or friends who are already living overseas, and they told me who to go with. Or my uncle or my uncle's friend is a facilitator and helped me get the paperwork together and move on to the next stage. Also, there were a lot of, we interviewed a few women recruiters who were returnees themselves for the most part. So they had worked as domestic workers. They had made contacts with families that were looking for maids in whatever country they were living in. And so they said, oh, no problem, I'll send you somebody. And they sometimes did that while they were still working abroad. So they just organized for someone to come out. Or when they returned to Ethiopia, they would find, again, people from their local community and link them directly to employers in whichever country that they had worked in. So here's some quotes that illustrate the real trust put in kind of personal contact. So for example, there was a prospective migrant from Hadia who said, if a broker is a well-known person, there's no need to be afraid, which is of course a bit of a risk given that we certainly identified cases of trafficking and exploitation that occurred even though a family member or a personal contact had arranged the migration. And similarly, you know, prospective migrants and the women who are already working there call each other via phone and exchange ideas. And so this is another prospective migrant who chose facilitators based on what she was told by current domestic workers. And the other thing that came across extremely strongly in all of our interviews was that women are in a rush to leave as soon as they've made the decision to migrate. So speed to departure was more important than going in any kind of regular way in terms of fulfilling the criteria, such as getting the relevant certificates or medical checkups. People wanted to go as quickly as possible, and even if it meant paying a bit more, they would find a facilitator who could help them leave as quickly as possible. There was also some confusion as to which requirements, pre-departure requirements, were still in place. The Ethiopian law has changed a bit on this in recent years. And so, for example, there used to be a requirement to have completed a certain number of years of education, and this has been removed. And so therefore, some women who hadn't completed that level of education were going to go with illegal brokers specifically because they knew they wouldn't be able to produce an education certificate. But in reality, they don't need one anymore. in any case, a lot of the informal facilitators will forge whatever documents are required because it's seen as taking a long time to actually get them. So for example, there's something called the certificate of competence, and you can see in the gray bubble that, you know, if the woman wants to train and get the certificate of competence, she pays 2,500 birr. She doesn't want to, we can produce one for a little bit more money. I won't dwell on this too much. There's, while it seems that most domestic workers leave via Addis Ababa airport, there is an overland route via either through Sudan or Djibouti and then through Yemen. It sort of involves boats, walking, vehicles. It's much, much more dangerous, and it's entirely illegal. And people know it's illegal. There was no one was confused on that point. Everybody knew that if you traveled out of Ethiopia overland, you were not going in any kind of regularized way, but it was seen as more convenient in some cases. It was seen as a bit cheaper. It seemed to have become perhaps a bit more popular when there were fewer flights out of Ethiopia during the COVID-19 restrictions. And then mirroring the fact that the facilitators and recruiters themselves felt that they weren't able to secure the security or guarantee the safety of the migrants that they sent abroad. Actually, migrants didn't really feel that it was the responsibility of the recruiters. There wasn't a sense of accountability in that way from community members. They felt like the recruiters were doing their best much of the time. They were trying to help, and there was a kind of sense of, you know, whatever happens to you, you know, you're trying your luck. And you may end up with a good employer, you may end up with a bad employer, but it's really down to what happens once you've left the country. And so here, there's lots of quotes we heard over and over again. It's not the facilitator who determines your success. It's your luck of finding good employers. They can do nothing, especially the facilitators who are here in Ethiopia. And finally, a lot of the returnees were very grateful. Even when they'd had bad experiences, they felt that facilitators were a resource in the community who were helping people to make the most of their life chances. And so there was sometimes a bit of blame, particularly if they felt they'd been deceived. But many of the facilitators were seen as, you know, helpful members of the local community. So just quickly before I hand over to Mahlet for the recommendations that Freedom Fund will be taking forward, just a few kind of to wrap up kind of key implications of what our findings sort of mean really. And the first of that is that awareness raising is not sufficient. It's probably necessary, but it's not enough to translate into action on the part of migrants and their communities. So for one thing, it's simply not true at the moment that migrating the legal route is any safer than migrating the illegal route. I think that the aspiration is there and the intention behind the laws are very good. But at the moment, people talked about the fact that, you know, the laws are good on paper, but they're not being enforced. And plenty of licensed agencies are also operating under the law. They're also sending people without the right documentation. They're not necessarily fulfilling all the criteria. So at the minute, it's people talk about the lion without teeth, that there's a legal framework, but it doesn't actually ensure the safety of migrants. And community members are aware of that. And so as a result, they're being disincentivized to kind of pursue the regular forms of migration, particularly when it's more complicated and they have to get themselves to Addis Ababa and try to figure out who's licensed and who isn't, and so forth. I described this kind of web of different kinds of facilitators and the fact that there are multiple people in a long chain often, and that some of them remain hidden. There were some recruiters who said, I never meet a migrant. I do everything on phone or Facebook. That way they can't find me if things go wrong. And so it's not clear to anyone where they are in the chain, how the different players link to one another, and whether or not there's anybody licensed at the end of the chain. And then related to this is that there are compensation funds set up in Ethiopia that was part of the legal framework, but nobody really knows how they would access them. And furthermore, if you used an illegal broker on the way to even finding a licensed agent, the community members aren't sure if that would make them eligible because they were sort of partly legal, partly illegal. So there's a lot of confusion around that. The inefficiency of the kind of regular route of migration is also pushing people towards taking the irregular options. So there's a little bit of confusion around what is or is not required, but even those things that are still required, they can take a long time, getting the medical certificate, getting the training for the certificate of competence. And this is off-putting, particularly because the top priority for prospective migrants seems to be having an easy and very quick route out of Ethiopia. And then on the flip side of that, we were told by some informal facilitators that they had looked into trying to become registered agencies, but that was very bureaucratic and difficult. And then finally, it's certainly true that for now, really the safety of these domestic workers is determined by what conditions that they face once they arrive at the destination country. And there's very little that people in Ethiopia have control over whether or not they're in a country where there's very little safeguarding of migrant rights and they end up in a household that is abusive or exploitative. But we did find, particularly in that first phase of research, when we talked to policymakers and some returnees, we did find that things seem to be getting better and that the role of having a labor attaché in Ethiopian embassies abroad who would concern themselves with issues of migrant well-being, that seemed to, seemed to be getting better and had the potential to work, although not everywhere. So I'm going to hand over to Mahlet to talk you through the recommendations, and I'm more than happy to answer questions later on in this webinar, but also by email once you've had a chance to read the report, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna, for that great presentation and walking us through the research study and the findings. Highly appreciated. So having analyzed the key findings, we were able to draw some key recommendations. As you see here on the display, there are rather many in number, and so I'll only be taking a few minutes focusing on a few of them for just the sake of time. So we've stated a few recommendations here that NGOs can undertake as part of their role to ensure that potential migrants choose regular migration. One of which is that they have to work towards enhancing the potential migrants' understanding of and access to the legal migration process. As you've heard already from Joanna's presentation, potential migrants fall in the hands of facilitators, recruiters, or brokers in their search for a guide on how to travel abroad for domestic work. The information available to them is mostly through these actors, and due to the already mentioned factors like competition among recruiters and the fact that facilitators lack the capacity or interest in protecting migrants, the information that reaches them, the migrants, is often not precise and at times even false. We have migrants whose understanding of legal requirements is so minimal that they believe that they migrate legally as long as they travel by plane. Some of them also use tourist visas to enter their destination countries with the wrong understanding that any visa is good enough to enable them get employment, which however results in having them trapped in a foreign country exposed to domestic servitude and human trafficking. This is also one of the results of lack of clear information, primarily shared by the people in the middle, facilitating the migration process for them. Thus, we say that one of the very key responses here is that potential migrants understand what legal migration is and that they can access the services to migrate legally. They need to be provided with information on what is regular and irregular migration and what qualifies recruitment agencies as legal or illegal, which countries they can legally travel to for domestic work, where to go and who to contact to access services like vocational training and COC to be legally eligible to migrate for domestic work. What documents are required to process their travels and how long that should take. This role can primarily be played by NGOs in the country who closely work on migration and issues of migration, and they can bring a major change in this area through raising the awareness of potential migrants. Similarly, we've also learned from the findings that most potential migrants consider the regular path time-consuming, also again, as well explained by Joanna earlier, and that they prefer to migrate as fast as possible, that they end up using illegal or irregular routes. The other recommendation we're making here is that all potential migrations, whether traveling legally or illegally, need to be provided with the information on the available support mechanisms at the destination countries. Again, this primarily falls as the role of NGOs working in collaboration with government offices, UN entities, and recruitment industry bodies, who can provide this information as part of their awareness raising sessions or ready them in, say, a form of pharmacons that potential migrants can carry with them wherever they are, within or outside of the country. For instance, NGOs can choose to include contact information of attaches when and if available, and domestic workers associations in the destination countries that migrants can reach out to for protection and support. And what we're saying here is that, therefore, this needs to be available for all migrants, despite their type of migration, whether irregular or irregular. We've also made several recommendations, as you can see here, in relation to efforts that need to be exerted from the side of the government of Ethiopia. One of which is that the migration process needs to be speedier for potential migrants to be able to choose it. As you've heard from the findings, one of the reasons why prospective migrants use illegal ways, even when knowing that they are illegal, is to avoid the bureaucratic and time-taking process they'll have to go through should they choose the legal ways. We've heard stories time and again that once a woman decides to migrate for domestic work, she wants it to happen the next day as soon as possible. However, the reality is far from that, and the long wait wears these women out of patience. There are key services that are provided by government offices like the technical and vocational college, the vocational training, and the pre-departure training is also provided by government bodies. In the process of reading potential migrants to migrate for domestic work, which are mostly sluggish, pushing the prospective migrants towards choosing illegal routes. Not only that, but accessibility is also an issue, as the services may essentially be unreachable throughout the country in a way that meets the demand. What we are therefore saying here is that, recognizing this issue, the government needs to work towards increasing the speed and ease of getting the required documents for regular migration, which will be one key method to discourage irregular migration and also unlicensed recruiters. The other recommendation is that the government needs to invest in adequate labor attaches or other diplomatic staff at the countries of destination, who have the primary duty of monitoring and providing support in ensuring the protection of the rights, safety, and dignity of Ethiopians employed overseas, as stated under the Proclamation 923 and 1246. We hear a number of tragic stories from the Middle Eastern countries that Ethiopian women migrants go through during employment for domestic work. And returns also point out the fact that domestic workers from other countries receive better treatment and protection as a result of having someone who stands on their behalf at their embassy as citizens of a country. Several Ethiopian missions were suddenly closed due to COVID-19, as Joanna also mentioned earlier, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs needs to make this a priority to reinstate consular services and place appropriately trained staff to ensure that its citizens are also better protected and their rights are respected. This would definitely require resources, and the government needs to be willing to allocate resources to avail and empower such staff in destination countries. Next slide, please. The other, and perhaps for me, the final recommendation I would like to highlight here is building the capacity of agents so that so they can function optimally in accordance with the legal framework. More often than not, the licensed international agencies function under a number of gaps, including lack of technical capacity and understanding on the existing legal framework for safe migration. For example, to state a few of these gaps, they fail to recruit and process prospective migrants as per the legal requirements of overseas employment. And also they fail to pass on accurate information to potential migrants. They're not fully equipped in terms of the required staff. They fail to pass on migrants' information to the consulates in the country of destination as is expected from them to do. And they don't produce and share timely reports with the mandated government offices and much more. For those who are licensed, fulfilling all requirements, they compete against those who are functioning illegally, and will need to create a supportive environment for licensed agents so they can strengthen their role and potential. The harsh reality is that this is just business for the recruitment agencies, and they lack the interest and time to act on behalf of the migrants as they should, as is also verified by this study. Hence, the industry overall, responsible government bodies, especially the Ministry of Labor and Skill, that is assigned to regulate the overseas employment services provision, which also entails safeguarding the rights, safety of migrant workers, to administering the agencies on conducting monitoring and investigation, and even non-governmental bodies need to intercept this to capacitate the agencies to help them function optimally in accordance with the legal framework. This is just a highlight of some of the key recommendations. Thank you for listening, and back to you, Liz.
Great, thank you so much. I'm sharing right now in the chat the link to the full research report, so everybody has that on hand. And just a reminder that you can add questions to the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen. It's actually right next to the chat function. And is a separate area. But we've got a few questions to start off, if I may. The first question is for Joanna. Did you observe different groups of recruiters with distinctly different motivations? And can you tell us more about that?
We did. I would say we talked to recruiters and facilitators kind of along a continuum. So there were some who were absolutely very kind of profit motivated, were quite willing to admit that they didn't mind what they told prospective migrants as long as it convinced them to go with them, that they were just, you know, doing it for the money, really. But then there were others that were the extreme opposite side of the spectrum, including some women who had themselves been domestic workers and really were, the way they told it, were just doing favors for friends. So it was like, oh, you know, the people who employed me, their neighbors need a maid, why don't you go there? And some of them didn't even take any money for that. They were just kind of helping people out. So yes, there's a very, very wide continuum of motivations, and then there's, you know, those things can overlap. You can make money, but and see yourself to be doing a service to the community. So yes, there was a wide range.
Okay, and I actually have another question for you. Did you find that participants in different geographies had different understandings or views of migration?
No, that was surprisingly consistent. Generally speaking, the only differences were that the closer we were to Bahadar, which was the town from which people were more likely to start an overland journey, that area had more of a willingness to take the risks of an overland journey, whereas people who were further from Bahadar and were much more likely from that area to go via Addis Ababa and then fly out, some of them said that it was possible to go to Bahadar and take the overland route, but they were more reluctant to do so, and I guess it's because they wouldn't know so many people who were involved in facilitating or having experienced that route.
Okay, thank you. And I think this next question is maybe also for Mahlet. So please, both of you, feel free to jump in. Is there support or a protection program for labor activists, advocates, or workers who report or expose people who are involved in illegal recruitment or trafficking in either the country of origin or the country of destination?
Mahlet, do you want to talk about the Ethiopian situation?
You broke up for a second, Liz. Could you please say the question again? Sorry.
Sure. What kind of support, if any, is there for like labor activists, advocates, or workers who are reporting illegal recruitment or human trafficking?
Thank you. I cannot say there's much that has been done in this area. I'm not even informed of any advocacy that happens in terms of reporting such brokers and recruitment agencies. And so,
Okay.
Joanna,
From the community level, we did hear about some returnees said that the person who had sent them was now in prison. There were a couple of cases where we spoke to somebody who said that the person who had helped them leave the country had subsequently been arrested for trafficking and had been in prison. One person was still in prison. He was actually her family member. Her uncle had ended up in prison. And certainly when we wanted to talk to unlicensed recruiters, they were hard to get because they were afraid. They were afraid that they might be turned in. They were afraid of repercussions. They know that they're in an illegal position. And so to have the interviews, we had to promise, anonymity. We didn't write down anybody's real names. And often the interviews were taking place in, like hotel lobbies that were quite a bit further away from where the recruiter actually lived. So there must be some form of reporting people for trafficking or exploitation, or they wouldn't be so worried.
Okay, and then the next question we have, besides consular resources overseas, what did you find could be some key points of accountability in the facilitation chain?
So I think that's more of a, how do you analyze the data and think about accountability? I mean, there was nothing came up in the interviews about accountability, really. The policymakers we interviewed tended to emphasize the importance of enforcing the laws as they are on paper. So there was a lot about how these various proclamations that have been passed in Ethiopia are pretty good. And they're, well thought through, and they have some measures in them that would be, could be effective if they functioned. But the real question is how, and I can't answer it, is how do you make them function? I don't know if other countries have had experience of having gone from a kind of good legal framework but poor implementation down the road of kind of tightening it up so that the whole system actually works. I would say there needs to be more done in the destination countries, but it's not really my area of expertise.
Great, thank you. Then this next question, I think goes again to both presenters, and it's a bit of a multi-part question. So one of the recommendations is on strategic litigation in countries of destination. Are there any examples of this being a successful strategy to change policies or practices? Cross-border litigation is not commonly accepted in the Middle East, but moreover, in our experience, most returned migrant workers are not interested in litigating. So let's start with the question on litigation and then jump into the second.
No one talked about litigation in the interviews themselves. I don't think that's something people necessarily know about. There was one case, this is more relating to compensation than litigation. There was only one case where somebody was able to access the insurance, that is, after having had an accident while abroad. Her aunt tracked down the recruitment agency that sent her, and after a bit of a difficult interaction was able to extract the insurance money. So I don't know about the cross-border stuff, but I would say that all of the licensed agents in Ethiopia are supposed to have a fund. One of the requirements of registering as an agency is to have the equivalent of $100,000 kind of on bond to pay compensation in case something happens to the migrant. And nobody we spoke to, policymakers, nobody knew of any case where that had happened. Nobody knew how you would do it, how you're supposed to, whoever checks whether or not this money is ever used, how a migrant might try to get it. And the only case that we were told about, like I say, where this aunt kind of made, I'm not even sure that was a licensed agent, so we don't know. But the aunt just kind of gave the person who'd sent her niece a hard time until they gave her some money.
Great, thank you. Yeah. And then this, oh, Mahalet, please.
Yeah,
jump in.
to add a few points on that, we work with several partners in our program, and we obviously work with several returnees who have gone through a huge amount of trouble and a huge amount of issues while in the destination countries. But coming back to Ethiopia, coming back to Addis, and having worked with our partners, they're never interested to litigate. I mean, they go through, we see them go through psychological issues, mental issues, suffer from this and that, but we don't understand, we can't push them to litigate, but we haven't found a single person, a single returnee who have been able to litigate yet.
Thank you. All right, and then the second part of that question, Joanne, I believe this came up in the research, is why was it that there was such a rush to migrate as soon as the decision was made? Was the decision often as a result of distress?
No, I don't think so. I think there are two things. I think we don't know enough yet, and it came out also. We did some formative research 3 or 4 years ago on behalf of the Freedom Fund as well, and we found the same thing then. And our partners, the Population Council, who are partners on this research, they've done separate research into internal migrants. So women who, girls mostly from rural areas who come into Addis Ababa to be domestic workers. So they're not leaving the country. They did the same thing. They woke up one morning and were on a bus that afternoon. Like, I should go and be a maid. And then they were gone. I think there's two things. One is, I think there's a culture of impulsive decision making. I think that people have generally a kind of, my fate is in God's hands. I have to try my luck. Everybody has their own luck is a kind of a refrain we heard a lot. So it kind of doesn't matter if you plan or don't plan, you just go see what happens. But I also think there's a little bit of a normative, if you start to tell people you're going to migrate, then they want you to, they don't understand why you're still hanging around. There's a bit of a pressure to leave. So we did interview one person who said, when I decided to migrate, I didn't tell anyone because I knew it would take a few months to get organized, and everyone meets you in the market and they're like, why are you still here? So I think there might've been a bit of that. Then we did a validation workshop in Addis Ababa a few weeks ago, and the same issue came up, and some of our stakeholder sort of who were being consulted on this in Ethiopia raised the issue that sometimes the family, once they've decided to migrate, the family has to get that money. They have to either sell some land or sell livestock, or they get a loan. And so the sense is you don't want them to be in debt for too long. You've got to leave as quickly as possible so you can start paying back that debt with your salary.
Additional to that, we've also come across some domestic workers who travel to Addis Ababa to transit through, and it is not easy for them to stay with a relative or get hired as a domestic worker in Addis and spend days, staying with relatives or getting employed. So they prefer to migrate as soon as possible because that's simply inconvenient for them.
Thank you. All right, the next question that I've got is, what did forced labor survivors report might be some points that would have changed their trajectory of exploitation?
First of all, it's very hard to characterize who was a forced labor survivor because there were so many different points along the way where exploitation might or might not happen. So there were, some women who had multiple trips to different countries, and so they'd been exploited in some countries but not others. We interviewed a lot of women who had been forcibly repatriated from Lebanon because Lebanon had had an economic collapse. It coincided with the COVID pandemic. And so there was kind of this mass deportation actually they were repatriated through the help of the Freedom Fund because they were thrown out of the homes of employers who were unable to pay them. And it was unclear how many of them were actually forced labor situations because many of them had perfectly good positions and were having a perfectly good time. And then the problem was that they just couldn't get paid at the end of it because the employers had a financial crisis. So I struggle to even identify who's clearly been trafficked and who hasn't. There's sort of a continuum there as well. And I can't say that there were very specific things that people said. I guess the most obvious one is don't let your employer tell you that she's going to pay you at the end. You know, demand that monthly salary and go back to, you know, there's this right to go back to the broker if you can, or the employment agency in the destination country, if you can track them down to help you get your salary or to move to another household that's going to treat you better, that kind of thing. But again, they couldn't always, those agents don't always respond.
All right, the next question I have is for Mahlet. Regulating recruiters seems like a very huge task, considering how many agencies there are. Where would you propose to start?
Thank you, Liz. So yeah, it's true that we have quite a large number of recruitment agencies in Ethiopia, all of whom are not may not be legally registered, while legality ensures better services for migrants. There are government offices with the mandate to ensure this. For example, the Bureau of Labor and Skill has the mandate to monitor these entities. And I would say that it's better to start from ensuring that all recruitment agencies are primarily legally registered, licensed, well equipped with the required technical and financial capacity and manpower. There are so many gaps in the system that ends up allowing unregistered agencies to provide services to prospective migrants, and parallel to ensuring the legality of the available agencies, the government also needs to be stricter in taking measures on the illegal ones to ensure that they're held legally responsible for their actions. This is an issue well known to the government, but one that feels like it's being given a blind eye. And I would say that if we as a country lack the will to take serious measures on these agencies that make a life for themselves out of the misery that they're causing to poor women, I don't think a sustainably meaningful change will be achieved in this regard. So yeah, I would say we start from legalizing agencies and taking serious measures on the illegal ones as a priority.
Thank you. And then I have one more question for each of you, just as we're starting to close up in these last few minutes. Joanna, are there any gaps in the research findings, and what future research could fill those gaps real quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an evolving thing. So when we did some formative research 4 or 5 years ago, the situation of migration was different. Now it's, you know, also evolving. COVID affected the routes that were available, the demand, supply. People are saying, you know, there was a long time where it was hard to leave the country. So now there's a little bit of a kind of backup of people who want to go. Certainly the conflict in Ethiopia is likely to change migration patterns, perhaps increase the interest of people to leave. So the first thing to say is it's kind of an ongoing monitoring thing that needs happening, a kind of keeping an eye on the migration landscape. I also learned that some of the things that we found about the weaknesses in the registered agents, some of that had been fixed. So when we tried to contact licensed agencies, the website where they were all being listed was always down. And when we tried to call 400 different agencies, and only 40 had working phone numbers. But I have since spoken to someone who did an assessment about a year after we did and said, no, there is a functioning list now and you can contact them and they have an association. So things are constantly moving, and we need to keep on top of that so that we're not planning our policies on old data. The gap, of course, is the Middle East. And so it's hard to do research there, but to try to understand, you know, what goes on and what happens to the domestic workers once they're there, and realistically how they're able to access assistance from different ways, and what are the informal networks. I think that would be the gap to fill.
Thank you. Okay, and then finally for Mahlet, now that we've seen these findings, how will they impact Freedom Fund's work in Ethiopia and beyond?
Well, Freedom Fund has been working on cyber migration in Ethiopia for years now, and I would say that we've understood the gaps in terms of the level of awareness of potential migrants and recruitment agencies have on the legal requirements, and also the gap that exists in the overall migration system. However, the findings from this study are reconfirmations on these lingering gaps, and so going forward, I believe that the findings would serve as reminders to both the Freedom Fund and any organization engaged in migration-related work on the fact that resolving issues of migration cannot be achieved single-handedly, and that it requires a collaborated effort of all concerned parties. That Freedom Fund is on the right track with its designed responses to the existing situation, and needs to work more in terms of regulating recruiters and empowering potential migrants and the community at large on legal migration, and also supporting the government towards bringing systematic change that address the required support. And finally, given the issue is wide and the outcome severely impacting Ethiopian girls and women, Freedom Fund needs to work more towards supporting the ratification of certain key conventions that would help protect the rights of CDWs. So for me, the findings are a good reflection of where we are as an organization in terms of our responses to the existing gaps and where we should be headed next as we continue to strive to meet our vision of seeing a world free of modern slavery.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you to both of our speakers and everyone who was able to attend today. Joanna, if you would advance to the next slide really quickly. I just wanted to plug one more time that the research report is available online on the Freedom Fund's website. And I will be able to share that link along with the recording of today's session for anyone who has who registered in advance. And we can go ahead and conclude here. Thank you so much for your time. And we look forward to hearing more from Joanna and Mahalet in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.